Look at him, a coat-rack in a fur hat. I have seen warmer movement from a hat stand. That was the first thing the great choreographer ever said about one of my men, and he said it loud enough for the whole receiving line to hear, because a man like that does not waste a cruelty on a small audience. I am the officer who commanded the watch that night, and I want to tell this properly, because I was there for the whole arc of it, the insult, the long hour the man stood under it, and the thing that broke the room open at the end. I have served 19 years. I have stood beside men who were spat at, shoved, photographed like zoo animals, and ordered to bow by people who had never been told no in their lives. I thought I had seen every shape an insult could take. I had not seen this one. The occasion was a gala in the long gallery of our house. I will not give you the house's name. It does not matter. It is older than the insult and will outlast it. The Crown was hosting an evening of dance to mark the reopening of the Royal Theatre, and the man we had invited to choreograph the centerpiece was the most celebrated living maker of dance in the world. I will call him the maestro, because that is what everyone called him, and because he had stopped answering to anything humbler decades ago. He had filled opera houses on 5 continents. He had made and unmade careers with a glance. He arrived with an entourage of dancers, lighting men, a personal photographer, and a way of walking into a room that announced the room had now begun. My sentries lined the gallery at intervals, full ceremonial red wool, bearskins, white gloves, rifles grounded, eyes forward. Among them was a man I will call Sergeant Aldous Vane. He had come to my company 11 months earlier from another regiment with a quiet record and quieter manners, and he had the stillest stand I have ever supervised. Not stiff. People always say stiff. There is a difference, and it took the maestro to teach me what it was, though he never meant to. The maestro stopped in front of Vane on his way down the gallery, the way a man stops in front of a portrait he intends to mock so that others will laugh with him and feel clever. He looked Vane up and down. He tilted his head. And then he said the thing about the coat rack and the hat stand, and his dancers laughed, and the photographer's shutter went off twice. Vane did not move. That is the whole of his response, and I want you to understand that it was not nothing. It was the most disciplined thing in that gallery. But to the maestro, stillness was the worst insult a body could offer, because stillness was the one thing his whole art was built to defeat. You see, the maestro said to his circle, gesturing at my sergeant as though Vane were a teaching aid, this is what we are fighting against. This is the enemy. The body that has forgotten it is a body. They train it out of him, they take a living man and they teach him to stand like furniture and they call it honor. He stepped closer. He was a small, immaculate man with silver hair swept back and the eyes of someone who had been the most interesting person in every room for 40 years. Tell me, soldier, has anyone ever taught you to move, or only to hold still and let the world walk past you? Vane's eyes stayed forward. The gala murmured and flowed around the moment. I stood 8 feet to the left at my post by the gallery doors, and I felt the old heat rise in my neck, the heat that wants to step in and end it. I did not step in. You do not for words. Words are the test. That is what the post is. But I marked the maestro's face, because in 19 years you learn to tell the difference between a man being thoughtlessly rude and a man who has decided to make sport of you, and this was sport. He made it sport for the rest of the hour. He came back. That is the part that tells you who he was. A thoughtless man insults you once and forgets. The maestro returned to Vane's post between every course, every speech, every set change, the way a boy returns to poke a fire and see if it will finally do something. He brought new people each time, like an exhibit he was proud of. Watch, watch, he will not even blink. 40 years I have spent teaching the human animal to express itself, and the state has built a man whose entire profession is to express nothing. He mimed Vane's posture, drawing himself up rigid, his arms clamped to his sides, his chin jutting, a cruel little imitation that got the laugh he wanted every time. Magnificent, he would say. A masterpiece of deadness. I watched my sergeant absorb it. I have stood a lot of watches, and I know the small signs of a man under pressure, the jaw that tightens by a degree, the breath that goes shallow, the eyes that find a fixed point on the far wall and clamp to it like a drowning hand to a rope. Vane had none of them. His breath stayed long and even. His eyes were not clamped, they rested. And once, only once, and I do not think anyone else in that gallery caught it, when the maestro drew himself up into that mocking, stiff imitation and demanded, "Is this you? Is this the great art of the King's Guard?" I saw the corner of Vane's mouth do something that was not a smile and was not nothing. It was the look of a man watching someone get a thing exactly, precisely, confidently wrong. I did not understand that look yet. I would, before the night was over. Near the end of the second hour, the maestro grew bolder, because no one had stopped him and the wine had gone around, and an unchecked cruelty always grows bolder. He had finished the formal program. His company had danced the centerpiece, a sweeping, brilliant thing that earned a standing ovation, and he had bowed and let the applause wash him until it was almost obscene. And then, flushed with it, he came back down the gallery to my sergeant's post one last time, and this time he did not bring a joke. He brought a challenge. "I have a proposal for our friend the Kotrak," he announced, and his voice carried, and the nearer guests turned and the photographer lifted his lens. "I am told the King's Guard prides itself on discipline, on control of the body. Very well. I who have spent my life on the control of the body will give him a small test. One bar of music, one simple phrase of movement, a child could learn it. If our statue can manage even that, I will apologize to him in front of this entire room, and I will never again call him furniture." He smiled the smile of a man laying a trap with the door already shut. "And if he cannot, well, then we will all have learned what the inside of that beautiful red coat is really worth." It was a cheap trick, and everyone in earshot knew it. The man was a sentry on a state watch. He could not break his post to caper for a famous guest, and the maestro knew it and counted on it. Either Vane stayed frozen and proved the maestro's point about the dead furniture, or he stepped out of his discipline and proved the other thing, that a King's Guard could be made to dance for the amusement of a man who had insulted him for 2 hours. There was no good door. The maestro had built it that way. That is what made him good at his work, and rotten at being a man. I started forward to end it. It was time, past time. This had crossed from words into the manipulation of one of my men in front of the crown's guests, and my authority covered that. I did not get the chance, because Sergeant Aldous Vane spoke. And what he said stopped me with one boot off the ground. "Sir," he said it to me, not to the maestro, his eyes still forward, his voice low and even and pitched for my ears only. "Request permission to be relieved of my post for 3 minutes." I have given and received a great many strange requests under arms. I had never had one like that in that place at that moment, and I will admit to you that my first instinct was to refuse it flat. A sentry asks to be relieved when he is ill, when he is hurt, when nature is past denying, never to answer a guest's taunt. To grant it looked, on its face, exactly like surrender. It looked like the maestro had won, like I was sending my man out into the open floor to be made a fool of. But I had marked that look on Vane's face, the look of a man watching someone get a thing exactly wrong, and I had 11 months of his stand behind me, and the longest part of an officer's job is knowing which of his men have earned a moment of trust they have not yet explained. Vane had. I have never been able to put it more clearly than that. He had earned it. "Granted," I said. 3 minutes, Sergeant. The watch is yours after." I signaled the relief, Corporal Brask, who was standing reserve at the gallery's end, to take the post. Brask came up at the march, halted and took the ground, rifle grounded, eyes forward, and the line was unbroken. Not for 1 second was that gallery without a sentry on that mark. And I want that on the record because the maestro would later try to make a great deal of a guard abandoning his duty to perform, and it was never true. The post was held the entire time. What stepped out of the line was a man at liberty, properly relieved by his officer's word. Vane handed his rifle to Brask with the care you would hand a man your child. He removed his white gloves, one finger at a time, and tucked them into his belt. He took off the bearskin, and there was a small gasp at that, because no one in that gallery had ever seen one of us bareheaded, and it is a stranger thing than you would think. A king's guard with a human head of close-cropped gray hair, suddenly a person and not a monument. He set the bearskin on the floor at the foot of his post, upright and squared, the way you would set down something sacred. And then he stepped out into the open center of the long gallery, in his red tunic and his polished boots, and he turned and faced the maestro across 40 feet of parquet. "You offered a test," Vane said. His voice had changed. It was not louder, but it carried now, the way a thing carries when a man has stopped holding it in. One bar of music, one phrase of movement. You said a child could learn it. He let that sit. "I accept, but not your phrase, sir. I have heard your phrase. With respect, it is a phrase for children." A few people laughed, surprised, and the maestro's smile thinned at the edges for the first time all night. "If we are to do this in front of the crown's guests, let us do it honestly. You name any phrase from any work in your repertoire, anyone, and I will give it back to you. And then you and this room can decide whether the Kotrak has forgotten it is a body." The gallery had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty, the kind that leans forward. The maestro recovered fast, men like him always do. He laughed, spread his hands, played to his circle. "He wants the hard examination. Charming. The furniture has ambitions." But I was watching his eyes, and his eyes had stopped laughing a half-second before his mouth did. He had heard something in the way Vane stood now, out of the line, out of the bearskin, weight settled low and easy through the floor, hands quiet at his sides, but quiet the way a cat is quiet. And a man who has spent 40 years reading bodies for a living does not mistake that kind of stillness for the other kind twice. He had called it furniture for 2 hours. He was now, I think, beginning to suspect he had been mocking a loaded thing. But pride is a cliff with no rail. He had built the trap in front of the whole room, and the only way down he could see was through. "Very well," the maestro said, and snapped his fingers at his musicians who had not yet packed away. A pianist sat back down. "We will give the soldier his honest test. Something from the second act of my own, The Hunt. You will not know it. No one outside the great houses has seen it danced properly in 15 years. The variation I made for the finest male dancer of his generation. A killing variation. It has ended careers. Men half your age and twice your training have walked off my stage in tears because they could not hold the line of it." He smiled, and the cruelty came all the way back into it. 8 bars. Begin where you like. I will be generous and let you fail in pieces." He thought he had chosen a guillotine. I could see it in him. He had reached past the child's phrase and named the hardest thing he owned, a thing made for a once-in-a-generation talent, certain it would crush a middle-aged sentry into rubble in front of the people he most wanted to impress. Vane heard the name of the work, and the strangest thing happened to his face. It softened, not with fear, with something that looked, for all the world, like recognition, like a man hearing the name of an old house he used to live in. "The second act of The Hunt," Vane repeated quietly. "The stag's variation." He nodded slowly to himself. "Yes, I know the line of it." "You have seen it," the maestro corrected, sharp. "Knowing is another thing entirely." "I have not seen it, sir," Vane said. He looked up, and across 40 feet of floor he met the maestro's eyes for the first time all night and held them. "I danced it, at the National Theater, 16 years ago. You were not yet making your own work then. You were a young man in the 3rd row taking notes, and you wrote afterward that the stag that season was, and I quote you, the finest instrument the country had produced in a generation." The whole gallery had stopped breathing. "You did not make this variation for the finest male dancer of his generation, sir. You made it later, after you saw what I did with the role. You made it from me. I have stood in rooms when artillery landed close. The silence after is a physical thing. It presses on the ears. This was that silence, in a gilded gallery with a pianist's hand frozen above the keys. The maestro's face had gone the color of the parchment on the gallery walls. "That is a lie," he said, "but it came out thin. I would know you." "You would know the boy," Vane said gently. "I was 23. I had a great deal more hair and a name you would recognize and a future everyone told me was certain." He paused. "I gave it up. I do not need to tell this room why, and I will not. But I kept the one thing none of you can take with a word. I kept the line of it in here." He touched his own breastbone once with 2 fingers, the only large gesture he had made all night. "You called me a body that has forgotten it is a body. Sir, I have spent 11 months on that mark remembering every single hour that I am still exactly the body I was. Holding still is not forgetting. It is the hardest remembering there is." He turned to the pianist. "From the top of the Stag's Variation," he said, "all 8 bars, and then, sir, you will keep your word. I am not a man of dance. I will tell you that plainly so you will trust the rest of it. I came up through the infantry. My idea of grace is a battalion making a clean turn in the rain. I cannot give you the names of the things Vane did in the next 90 seconds because I do not know them. So I will only tell you what I saw as a soldier, standing 8 feet away with my heart climbing my throat." The pianist found the phrase. It began low and slow, a single line in the left hand, like something walking carefully through a wood. And on the 3rd beat, Sergeant Aldous Vane, 51 years old, in his red wool tunic and his issue boots, on a parquet floor in front of 200 of the Crown's guests, began to move. I had spent 11 months thinking I knew how that man stood. I knew nothing. He rose onto the ball of 1 foot, and the whole length of him lifted with it, unbroken, from the floor through the spine to the crown of his bare gray head, and it did not look like a man standing up. It looked like a thing the music was doing to him, like a note being drawn long. He turned, and the turn had no beginning and no end that I could find. It was simply that the room was facing one way, and then it was facing another, and the man in the middle had carried it around with him. The red tunic, which I had only ever seen as the still uniform of a still man, opened and closed around the movement like a flame leaning in a draught. I have used the word stillness about this man a great deal. I want to tell you what I understood watching him, about why his stillness on the post had been so absolute. It was because he had this in him the whole time. It was the same thing. A man who can move like that can hold still like that because both of them are control, the same iron control, poured one way or poured the other. The maestro had it exactly backward. The stillness was not the absence of the movement. The stillness was the movement held. There is a moment in the Stag's Variation. I learned its name later. I will not pretend I knew it then, where the dancer hangs at the top of a leap, just for an instant, with his whole body drawn out into one long diagonal line, as though the floor has agreed to forget about him for a heartbeat. Younger men, the maestro had said, walked off his stage in tears because they could not hold the line of it. I watched a 51-year-old sentry leave the floor and draw himself out into that line in the air, and hold it past the moment when a body should have come down, hold it the way he held his post, 1 heartbeat, 2, and the entire long gallery made a single sound, 200 people drawing breath at once, a sound I have only ever otherwise heard at the instant before something terrible happens, except that this was the instant before something beautiful did. And then he came down out of it as softly as a coat settling on a hook. And I do not use that image by accident, because I saw on 100 faces the exact second they remembered the word the maestro had used, kotrack, and felt the shame of having laughed at it. He danced all 8 bars. He did not rush them to be done. He did not milk them for the crowd. He gave the variation back the way you return something borrowed and well cared for, complete in good order with respect. On the last note he brought himself to a close, not a flourish, not a bow, but a simple return to standing, weight settling down through the floor, arms coming to rest at his sides, chin level, eyes forward. He came to attention. In the space of 1 breath the dancer folded back into the sentry, And the man who had just filled that gallery with motion was once again the stillest thing in it. And somehow the folding back, the return, was the most astonishing part of all. For a moment no one moved. Then the room broke. I have heard ovations. I had heard one for the maestro's own company an hour before. This was not that. An ovation for a performance is a warm thing, generous, a little dutiful. What came up out of that gallery for my sergeant was something rower. It had a crack in the middle of it, people clapping with their hands above their heads and something working in their faces. The sound a crowd makes when it has been shown that it was wrong about something, and is glad, fiercely glad, to have been wrong. Guests were on their feet. A woman near the front had both hands pressed over her mouth. The crown's own people, who do not as a rule display anything, were displaying something. And in the center of it stood the maestro, alone, the color gone out of him, his hands not moving. I will give him this single thing, because honor requires it of me even toward a man who had none toward my sergeant. He did not run. He could have slipped out in the noise. He stood there and took the full weight of that ovation as it broke over the head of the man he had spent 2 hours calling furniture. And I watched the most celebrated maker of dance in the world understand, in front of the people he most wanted to impress, that he had just been outdanced, at his own killing variation, the hardest thing he owned, by a 51-year-old sentry in army boots. Vane held his attention until the applause began, by its own weight, to quiet. Then he turned and faced the maestro across the floor one more time. And he did the thing that, of everything that happened that night, I have thought about the most. He bowed to him. Not the small nod of a colleague. A full, formal, deep bow, the bow a dancer gives the master whose work he has just performed. It was a bow of respect, freely given, by a man who had every right in that room to give nothing at all. And it was, I realized as I watched the maestro flinch under it, the cruelest mercy I have ever seen one man hand another, because Vane was not bowing to humiliate him. He was bowing to remind him and the whole gallery that the work itself, the variation, the line that Vane had just made live again, was the maestro's creation. He was giving the man back the one true thing he had, the thing that was real underneath all the cruelty, that he had once, when he was young and humble and taking notes in the 3rd row, seen a beautiful thing clearly enough to spend the rest of his life trying to make more of it. The bow said, "You made this. You are better than the way you have behaved tonight. I'm handing you the chance to be the man who could make this, instead of the man who mocks a sentry for an audience." The maestro stood under that bow as though it weighed more than the ovation had. His mouth opened. For a long moment nothing came out, and I thought he would do what proud men do, which is to find some last small poison and spit it and leave. He did not. "Where?" he said, and his voice was not the gallery voice anymore. It had gone low and rough and human. "Where did you go? I looked that season. The stag of the National Theater, and then nothing. No farewell, no final performance. The papers said you had been injured. I always assumed—" He stopped. He looked at the bearskin standing squared on the floor at the foot of the empty post, and at Corporal Brask holding the line, and at the red tunic, and something moved across his face that I can only call understanding, the late and terrible kind. "You were not injured." "No, sir," Vane said. "Then why?" It was not a demand anymore. It was almost a plea. A man who had built his whole self on the belief that there is nothing higher a body can do than what he did with it, asking the one person who had walked away from exactly that, why? And here Vane gave the room the only piece of himself he gave it all night, and he gave it plainly, without drama, the way he did everything. "My younger brother," he said, "he wore this coat before I did. He stood a post not unlike the one behind me. He did not come home from his service, and our mother did not come back from losing him, not really, and I was 3 weeks from a contract that would have taken me out of the country for 4 years. He let it sit, even and quiet. Someone in our house had to stay and stand the watch. The real one, the one over a grieving woman in a small flat, not the one in a gallery. So I put the dancing down, and when she had no more need of me, I found I could not go back to a stage and ask a paying room to admire my body after my brother gave his whole one and got a folded flag for it. It seemed small, so I took his coat instead. He looked steadily at the maestro. You have spent 40 years teaching the body to express everything. I gave mine to learning the one thing it can do that is harder than any leap in your repertoire. It can stand. It can keep faith. It can hold a line that no one is applauding for no audience at all, simply because the line is worth holding. He inclined his head just slightly. That is not the forgetting of a body, sir. That is the most a body can be asked to do. I learned the first thing on your stages. I learned the second one on the watch. I am grateful for both, and I will not have either of them called dead by you or anyone. There was no sound in the long gallery at all. The maestro crossed the floor. He crossed all 40 feet of it slowly in front of every guest, and the man who never apologized to anyone stopped in front of my sergeant, and he did not offer his hand, because he understood at last that a hand was not enough. He bowed. The maestro bowed to the King's Guard, lower than Vane had bowed to him, lower than I had ever seen that proud man bend his neck to any living soul, and he held it, and when he came up his eyes were wet, and he did not bother to hide it. I owe you an apology in front of this entire room, he said, his voice carrying now because he was making it reach every person who had laughed at his jokes for 2 hours. I said it as a trap. I meant it as a trap. I am keeping it as a debt. He turned slowly, taking in the whole gallery. I have spent the evening telling you that this man was furniture, that the discipline you see on those posts is a kind of death. I was wrong, not a little wrong, the way a man is wrong about a small fact. Wrong the way a man can be wrong about the whole point of his life. His voice cracked and he let it. I built my best work on what this man could do with his body when he was young. And tonight he showed me he had spent the years since doing something harder with it than I ever dared. I have been making dances about courage for 40 years. I have just met it. I am ashamed. And I am, he looked back at Vane, I am so grateful to have been shown, before it was too late, what I had been making fun of. I have thought since about how rare it is to watch a proud man actually change in front of you. It almost never happens. Pride does not bend. It breaks, or it walks out the door and tells a different story to a kinder mirror. But I watched it bend that night in the long gallery in front of 200 witnesses, and I think it bent because Vane gave it room to. A lesser man, a man whose discipline was only the brittle kind, would have used those 8 bars to destroy the maestro, to grind his face in it, to take the revenge that 2 hours of cruelty had more than earned. Vane did the opposite. He showed the man the most beautiful thing the man had ever made, and then he handed it back to him with a bow. He humbled him by giving, not by taking. I have served under generals who never learned that, and here it was in a sergeant. Vane straightened from the exchange, and I saw him glance just once at the bearskin standing squared at the foot of his post. The 3 minutes I had granted him were long gone. They had been gone before the first bar finished, and he knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us cared, but the watch is the watch. Sir, he said, turning to me, and his voice had folded all the way back down into the level register of a soldier reporting. Request permission to resume my post. Granted, Sergeant, I said. I was not certain my own voice would hold, and I was glad it did. He bent and took up the bearskin. He settled it. He drew the white gloves from his belt and put them on, one finger at a time, with the same care he had taken them off. He stepped to the mark, and Corporal Brask handed him back his rifle the way you hand a man back something you have been honored to hold, and Vane grounded it and squared his shoulders and brought his eyes forward. And that was all. The motion of him drained back into stillness, and within 10 seconds the man who had just stopped the breath of 200 people was once again, to all appearances, the most uninteresting figure in the gallery, a red coat and a tall hat and a pair of polished boots, holding a line that no one was applauding. Except that now the whole room knew what was inside it, and I watched the way the guests moved past his post for the rest of that evening, and it was changed utterly. They did not gawk. They did not raise their phones to him like a curiosity. They went quiet as they passed, and more than one of them inclined his head, the small bow you give a thing you respect, and Vane received each one the only way the post allows, by giving no sign at all, eyes forward, the discipline closing over him like water over a stone. But I had learned to read that man by then, and I will tell you he heard every one of them. The maestro did not leave the gala early, as a humiliated man might. He stayed, but he stayed differently. He spent the rest of the evening at the edges of the room rather than the center of it, and when people came to him, and they did, as people will come to a famous man who has just done something they have never seen a famous man do, he did not perform for them. He talked low and listened more than he spoke, and twice I saw him look down the gallery toward Vane's post with an expression I can only describe as a man looking at a door he had walked past for 16 years without knowing it was there. Near midnight, as the last guests were collecting their coats, the maestro came to me. I did not know what he wanted, and I confess I braced for it. Powerful men who have been embarrassed often go looking for someone of lower rank to make it right against. He did nothing of the kind. "You are his officer," he said. "I am, sir." "You granted the relief." He studied me. "You knew, when he asked you, you knew what he was." "No, sir," I said honestly. "I did not know any of it. I knew only that he had earned a moment I could not yet explain. That is most of what command is, in the end, knowing which of your men have built up that kind of credit, and being willing to spend it on their word." He was quiet for a moment. "I have commanded companies of dancers for 40 years, he said, "hundreds of them. I do not think I ever once gave one of them the benefit of the unexplained. I told them what to be, every hour down to the angle of a finger. I never once trusted one of them to know something I did not." He looked again toward the post. "I think that is why none of them ever did what he did tonight. You cannot make a man stand like that by telling him to. He has to choose it, over and over with no one watching for no applause. I never gave a single one of them the silence to choose it in." He shook his head slowly. "I have been the loudest man in every room for 40 years, and the most disciplined man I have ever seen has not raised his voice once tonight, except to give me back my own dance." He did not ask to speak to Vane again. I think he understood that to make my sergeant into a story he could carry around and tell would have been a kind of theft, the same theft he had attempted at the start of the evening, only kinder seeming. He left without it. He left with the silence instead, which is the harder thing to carry, and I respected him for choosing it. I will tell you what came after, because a story without its consequence is just a moment, and this was more than a moment. The maestro did not put any of it in the papers. There was no interview, no carefully placed account of the night the great choreographer was humbled by a palace guard. I had half expected one, the version where he came out looking generous, the version that made him the hero of his own apology. It never appeared. What appeared 8 months later was a new work. He called it simply the Sentry. It was a single male variation, danced by no famous principal but by a different young company member each performance. And it was, by every account I have read, the finest thing he ever made, a study of stillness and motion as the same act, of a body holding a line for no audience, of the leap that does not show, and the standing that costs everything. He dedicated it, the program said, to the men who learned the harder discipline, and to the one who taught me there was one. He never named Vane. He had finally understood that the not naming was the respect. I sent word of it to Vane, who by then had rotated to a different post. He read the dedication. He folded the program and put it away and said only, he kept his word then. "I am glad." And he went back on the watch, and that was the end of what he had to say about being, for one evening, the most extraordinary man in the kingdom. People ask me, when this story gets told in the mess and someone who was not there hears it for the first time, why a man like that, a man with that gift, a man who could have had stages and ovations, and his name carved over a theater door, why he would put it down to stand a post that any disciplined soldier can be trained to fill. They ask it as though he gave up the greater thing for the lesser one. I have come to believe they have it backward, the same way the maestro had it backward when he called the stillness a kind of death. Here is what I think, after 19 years and that one night. Anyone with the gift, and the years, and the hunger can learn to do an astonishing thing in front of a room that wants to see it. The applause pulls it out of you. The lights and the crowd and the held breath are a kind of hand under your back lifting. There is nothing small about it. I watched Vane do it, and I will carry the sight of it to my grave. But there is a help in it, an audience doing half the work by wanting the thing to happen. What is rarer? What is so much rarer that most men live their whole lives without managing it once, is to do the unspectacular thing perfectly when no one wants to see it, when there is no music, no light, no held breath, no hand under your back to stand a line in the cold with your face still and your heart faithful, hour after hour, for no applause that will ever come, simply because the line is yours to hold and holding it is right. The first is a talent. The second is a character. The first the world will pay you for. The second you must pay for yourself, every single hour out of your own pocket, with no one keeping count but you. Vane had both. That is what undid the maestro, not that the sentry could dance, but that the dancer could stand. The maestro had spent 40 years certain that the visible glory was the summit of what a body could do, and in 90 seconds a 51-year-old man in army boots showed him a higher one, and then folded it away and went back to the harder thing as though it were nothing, as though the dance had been the easy part. Because for Vane, I think it was. I have stood a great many watches since that night. I have stood them in rain that found every seam of the coat, and in cold that turned the rifle to a bar of ice in the glove, and in the long gray middle of a duty shift when there is nothing to test you but the weight of the unmoving hours themselves. And I have thought, more than once, of the maestro's question, has anyone ever taught you to move, or only to hold still and let the world walk past you? And of the answer my sergeant gave with 8 bars of music and then put away forever. The world does walk past us. That is the truth of the post. The Bible does not pretend otherwise. We stand, and the world streams by, and most of it never wonders what is inside the red coat, and a portion of it mocks, and now and then one of them is cruel for an audience. We are trained to let all of it pass, but letting the world walk past you is not the same as the world walking through you, and it is the furthest thing in creation from forgetting that you are a man. Every hour Vane stood that post, he was remembering the brother who wore the coat first, the mother he stayed for, the stages he set down, the line he kept in here, 2 fingers on the breastbone, the only large gesture he made all night. The stillness was full to bursting. It only looked empty to a man who had never had to fill one. So when someone asks me what the KingsGuard is for, now, I do not give them the answer about ceremony and tradition and the dignity of the crown, though all of that is true. I tell them about the night the most celebrated maker of dance in the world stood in the long gallery and called one of my men a co-track, a hat stand, a masterpiece of deadness, and how that man took off his hat and showed the room what deadness it was, and then put the hat back on and became, by his own free choice, the still and faithful and entirely living thing he had been all along. And how the great man crossed the floor and bowed lower than I have ever seen pride bend, and went away and made his finest work out of the lesson. The discipline you see on those posts is not a kind of death. I have it on the authority of the one man alive who knew enough about the living body to say so, and who spent his last best years saying it in dance. It is the most a body can be asked to do. It is a leap held so long and so still that it stops looking like a leap at all. Vane is older now. He will hang up the coat before long, the way his brother never got to. When he does, no theater door will carry his name and no nation will weep, and that is exactly as he would have it, because the watch he kept was never for an audience and he would be the first to tell you so. But I was his officer, and I stood 8 feet from him on the night. He reminded a roomful of the powerful what they had walked past, and I will carry it for him whether he likes it or not. He danced once for 90 seconds, 16 years after he had given it up, to answer a cruelty with a kindness. And then he came to attention and brought his eyes forward and went back to the harder thing. That is the man. That is the watch. That in the end is the whole of what I have to tell you, and it is enough.